Could this location quite literally be the end of the line for HS2? If Rishi Sunak gets his way, or a successive government does not overturn his decision, then the answer may sadly be yes. The location in question sits just outside the little-known villages of Handsacre and Armitage, located between Lichfield and Rugeley in Staffordshire. It's not somewhere I'd expect many people to have heard of, not least because the media have been reporting that HS2 will end in Birmingham, which is not at all accurate. It was always intended that there would be a junction at Handsacre connecting HS2 to the West Coast Mainline. However, it was only supposed to be the first of a number of connections that would allow trains to leave the new line and head north on the existing railway. In fact, before HS2 Phase 2 was split into Phases A and B, it was proposed that services would leave HS2 at Handsacre to travel to places such as Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow on the existing network before the completion of Phase 2 to Manchester and Golborne. Later, the plan was modified as it was decided to build Phase 2 in two separate phases, namely Phase 2A to Crewe and Phase 2B to Manchester. But in the interim, it was suggested that Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow could each be served by one HS2 service per hour to Old Oak Common as a sort of trial service until Phase 2A opened. Once Phase 2A opened, Manchester would have been served by 3 trains per hour, Liverpool 2 and Glasgow 1 train per hour, joining HS2 just south of Crewe. In addition, it was proposed that a service originating in Macclesfield would call at Stoke and Stafford before joining HS2 at Handsacre, utilising capacity freed up by Phase 2A. Now though, after Rishi Sunak's announcement at the Conservative Party conference back in October, trains will join the West Coast Mainline at Handsacre indefinitely, as he has cancelled possibly the most transformative sections of HS2. There will still be some capacity gains between Rugby and London Euston, however there will be no additional capacity created between Rugby and Manchester. In fact, it could be the case that disruptive upgrades will be required on the West Coast Mainline between Handsacre and College, or even possibly to Manchester, just so that HS2 services and local and regional services can continue to operate reliably. I plan to release a separate video which will cover the capacity issues in more detail, but in this video I just wanted to give a little more detail about the junction itself. Handsacre Junction would have provided the connection from a HS2 spur to the West Coast Mainline, with the spur requiring a grade separated junction to be constructed to the south of Handsacre. This junction would have split HS2 from the core line that would have later become HS2 Phase 2A to the spur that would join the West Coast Mainline. This is where things become complicated, as without Phase 2, the spur is no longer required, but the grade separated junction was part of the Phase 1 hybrid bill, so the big question now is, will this be redesigned or will the stub be left? Bearing in mind detailed designs have been drawn up and preparatory works for both junctions had already started. Granted, the sites for the junctions were mothballed earlier this year when it was announced that work on Phase 2A would be paused, but there are clear signs that work was getting underway. The site at Shore Lane now looks abandoned, whilst the only evidence that work had taken place is the stockpiles of topsoil and fencing which marks the boundary of the HS2 works. It may be possible to build the line from Lichfield to Handsacre without any significant design changes, but it still seems like an oversight that was not fully evaluated when Rishi Sunak made his decision. To further complicate matters, the connection to the West Coast Mainline was redesigned when HS2 Phase 2 was rephased, with the plans modified so that HS2 connected to the up-down slows on the West Coast Mainline rather than the original proposal for the HS2 tracks to join the up-down fasts, which would have been more costly and complicated but would have maximised capacity. Instead, in order for HS2 trains to join the fast lines, switches will be required from the up-down slows onto the fast lines, which would impact throughput of the junction. However, I'm not sure if additional switches were part of the updated proposals for Handsacre. This change wasn't as important with the plans for Phase 2A taking HS2 to Crewe and therefore reducing the burden on Handsacre, but without Phase 2 would provide a constraint which will impact West Coast Mainline services. On the face of it, Rishi Sunak's decision seems quite straightforward, terminating HS2 at a junction that was already part of the plan. but terminating HS2 at Handsacre indefinitely throws up a whole host of questions that I do not believe anyone yet has the answer to. During a Transport Select Committee HS2 update, Professor McNaughton said that a redesign of Handsacre was inevitable without Phase 2A, and suggested that without redesigning the junction, it would be impossible to run HS2 and freight services on this section of the West Coast Mainline. It's not clear what Rishi Sunak's decision will mean for Handsacre, or if significant design changes will be required, but all we do know is that for now, HS2 trains will leave the new line somewhere between Lichfield and Rugeley and will continue north on the West Coast Mainline. Be sure to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified when the next video is released, which will look at the capacity implications in a little more detail.